Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show, everybody. It is One Question with Pastor Adam, and I am Adam, and I am pastor to believers and doubters, to unfaithful Christians and faithful atheists. And we all know by now, it's been 2 years or so into this, that Jesus wasn't afraid of questions, and neither are we here at One Question. So we ask the big questions, and today we have our work cut out for us because our question today is Paul the Progressive. As many of you know who have been coming to our Zoom Bible studies, I have thought for quite a while, ever since I went to seminary, that Paul is actually one of progressive Christianity's best friends. And this surprises a lot of people. And because we tend to have a very negative view on Paul. Paul has been known for being anti-women, anti-LGBTQ, anti a whole lot of things. And when I was in seminary, I was first introduced to this idea that actually Paul was very pro women. And Paul has been misunderstood almost from the very beginning of Christianity. And so as I've been like thinking about these things ever since seminary, I'm like, somebody has got to have written a book about Paul the Progressive, right? So I just did a quick Google search, and hey, friends, here we go. Paul the Progressive, the Compassionate Christian's Guide to Reclaiming the Apostle as an Ally. Somebody give me an amen in the chat section. Let's do this thing, because Paul has been hijacked for too long by folks who have different ideas than what Paul had. And so we are going to reclaim Paul today with Dr. Eric Smith, who wrote this great book. Dr. Smith is the assistant professor of early Christianity and contemporary Christian practices at Iliff School of Theology in Denver. He has served as a minister for more than 15 years in progressive Christian congregations. He is an ordained minister in the Christian Church, the Disciples of Christ, a sibling church to my denomination, the United Church of Christ. And I am going to bring in Eric now. So everybody, let's give Eric a big round of applause in the chat section. Here we go. Hi, Eric. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
I was so excited when I Googled Paul the Progressive and came across your book. I bought it right away and just dove right into it. It is like, it's clear, it's easy to read. You make really great arguments. You go from one of the things that has been so important for me to learn is how much study has been done in academia during the last 50 years or so on Paul that the church has just not caught up to. And the church, if it were to catch up to this, our whole understanding of Paul would be radically different. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely, yeah. So it really has only been in the last generation or two of biblical scholarship that there's been this real sea change in the way people understand Paul. There's been this tradition of reading Paul in a certain kind of way since really the time of Martin Luther. And it's been very theologically determined, very, very Protestant, very anti-Catholic, very anti-Jewish. And this way of reading Paul just predominated. And it was only in the 1960s, 1970s, and then really since then that a new generation or a couple generations of biblical scholars has started to reconsider Paul and read him on different terms. Sometimes this is called the Paul within Judaism perspective, or sometimes it's called the new perspective on Paul. And it's just a way to kind of peel back those layers of theology and read Paul something like more on his own terms instead of reading him through this theological lens. So it's really taken over biblical scholarship. It hasn't, as you say, really made its way into churches yet, but it's happening slowly but surely.
Yeah. Well, that's our job today, Eric. So we've got a big hill to climb right here, and you do a great job in your book. And we can just go over a couple of topics. So, friends, my goal for this is to get you excited about this book, because it's a game changer. And thank you for writing it. you get at, Jim says, an old friend said, I was a Christian till I married a Baptist. That's good, Jim. Thank you for that. Friends, if you have comments or questions about Paul that you'd like us to go over, please feel free to put those in the chat section. Emily says, thank you for writing this book. It's fantastic. So you went into a little bit of Paul and Judaism. A lot of what we know about Paul or think we know about Paul comes from Martin Luther, who had his own issues. We all have our own issues. But when we get back to Paul in first century context, a lot of people think that Paul is making up a new religion that is Christianity, right? What is Paul doing? You reference a book in your book called "Paul Was Not a Christian." Paul is not making up a new religion, but what is he doing? And what do we do with the anti-Semitism that is so real today and often justified with Paul?
That's a great set of questions. That book, by the way, Paul Was Not a Christian by Pamela Eisenbaum, is fantastic, and it's out in paperback. So folks should pick that up if they are interested in this topic. Yes. So Martin Luther had his own things, as you say. And one of his things was he was just consumed by guilt and shame and feelings of inadequacy before God. And so he goes looking for ways to understand that. And he reads Paul that way. He reads Paul as sort of having the same experiences of inadequacy before God. And he's reading, the first part of Romans. He's kind of just seeing this in Paul, I think, in a way that is very specific to Martin Luther. It's not as much of a universal experience, and I don't think it's as shared with Paul as Luther might have thought. But he sees then Paul as sort of a fellow traveler, as someone who has struggled with the same problem, and it happens to be the problem that he has with the Roman Catholic Church at the time too, which is you just can't work your way out of how bad you are. To use the language of John Calvin, we're totally depraved. Humans are just terrible, and you can't do enough good things to make that okay. So he sees the Catholic Church as sort of missing the point on that. He sees his own life as being sort of mired in that problem. And he reads then Paul's reading of Judaism that way, as sort of a mirror for the Catholic Church. So this is really the Lutheran perspective is it's reading Paul in a way that makes Paul say Judaism is bad. It's a defunct religion. I have to convert away from it in order to find truth. And I think none of that is actually true if you read Paul closely. The idea that he converted away from Judaism to Christianity isn't true at all. And this is really the premise of that book I mentioned a moment ago. He's not a Christian because there was no such thing as Christianity to convert to. He didn't convert. In fact, he's so proud. If you read Paul, he frequently will say how proud he is of his Jewishness, of Judaism, of the sort of privileges of being Jewish, of being God's people. And so I think part of the Paul within Judaism perspective, or the new perspective, is simply to read Paul that way instead of Martin Luther's way. Instead of being mired in your own sense of worthlessness, to read Paul as someone who was Jewish, stayed Jewish, valued the Jewish life, the Jewish God, and thought that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, the Jewish son of the Jewish God, and built his claims around that. But, and here's the important part, but Paul became convinced on his road to Damascus experience that God was asking him to go tell the Gentiles about this. And so when he says, things about Judaism, it's not because he thinks Judaism is bad. It's because he thinks Gentiles need to follow God's call, and they can't do it by becoming Jews. They need to do it by paying attention to this person, Jesus.
Emily says, amen. The feeling of unworthiness and the scales fall away when you seek. Man-made weather is a real thing. the scales fall away. An excellent metaphor there, Emily, for talking about Paul. What do you make of Paul? You mentioned the road to Damascus. And there's some criticism of Paul as he is on the road to Damascus, breathing threats of murder against these early followers of the way. They're not Christians yet, as you say. They're followers of Jesus, right? So, what do you make of that experience with Paul on the road to Damascus?
Good question. So Paul doesn't really narrate this experience himself. This is only really found in the book of Acts, where it's told three times. Paul, the character Paul in that story, tells the story three times. But that story, I think, looks, a lot of scholars have pointed out, it looks a lot like a prophetic call. If you look at the way the Hebrew prophets in the Hebrew Bible talk about their sense of calling from God, and you look at the way Paul talks about that experience of sort of foreknowledge before birth, that God has ordained me for this purpose, this is the language Paul is using. So it's an experience it was clearly very, very real for Paul. It had this enormous impact on his life. He changed a lot of things about his life because of that experience. And we can argue, whether it was really Jesus, or some people say, oh, he had an epileptic seizure. It doesn't matter. Paul has this experience, and he feels a call in his life at that moment that is not a conversion. Like that's where I think we get it wrong sometimes, is people say, oh, that's the moment where he converted, he changed his name from Saul to Paul. No, that's not at all what it says. It says he had this experience, and he felt from that point forward like he was the apostle to the Gentiles, that Jesus in that moment had asked him to stop persecuting him and to begin taking this message to the Gentiles, which simply means to everyone who's not a Jew. And so I think that it's a pivotal moment, but I think we've misunderstood why it's pivotal. It's not a conversion. It's a moment of Paul receiving kind of clarity about what he was supposed to do with his life.
Is this like, I've heard some people call this like Paul is universalizing Judaism. Does that phrase make sense to you? Is that an appropriate phrase to think about it, or?
It does a little bit. There had been for a long time a sort of strand of Judaism, and you can see this in some of the prophets, that understood that yes, we are God's people. This is a covenantal relationship between Israel and God, but also it's going to eventually be bigger than this. And so there had always been kind of a vision that we are a people who set apart not only for ourselves and not only for God, but for the nations, for the world, and we're going to be a light to the world. So you can see this. This is part of the story of Judaism and of Israel, really for a long time. And Paul, I think, picks up on that, and the Jesus tradition picks up on that. So he's universalizing a little bit, but he's doing it in a way that makes a lot of sense, and it would have made sense to someone who is a first century Jewish person. Yeah.
Like Isaiah 25, where people from all around the world are coming to the mountain, to God's mountain, to worship on there, and everybody's invited to the party, right?
That's right.
The veil has been lifted from our eyes that see us as other or better than or whatever, and we all come together. A very progressive view that Isaiah is bringing forward, right? And Paul, I hear you saying, might be picking up on this and in inviting the Gentiles in, like the vision that Isaiah has already given 800 years before Paul shows up.
Yeah, I think texts like that help Paul make sense of what he's feeling. And so you can see him do these really interesting exegetical exercises in Romans, where he's reading, I think, Genesis 17, and kind of talking about Abraham being righteous before he was circumcised. And this is sort of an aha moment for him to say, before there was even really an Israel proper, God had been doing this kind of work of righteousness with the nations. And I think Paul uses scripture that way to kind of help him understand the Jesus event and what it might mean for the world.
This you bring up Genesis 17. This is the big controversy in the early church, right? That Paul is so zealous for, is that Gentiles, and maybe this I think is, for me, one of the things that really makes Paul progressive, is that he says Gentiles should be included as Gentiles, right? Like
Mhm.
there's this law that is clearly stated in Genesis 17 that in order to become the people of God, you gotta get the things cut, right?
Right.
And Paul's like, hey, this isn't working for Gentiles, and so uh, is it that they don't have to follow that law? What is Paul's relationship to the law, and is that part of what makes him progressive? It's anyway. I go ahead.
Yeah, and here's where I maybe part ways with some Pauline scholars. So I think a lot of people are really nervous about saying that Paul thinks there's more than one way to salvation, and I don't have a problem with that at all. I think Paul's basic thing here is stay in your lane, right? So God has a people; those people are Israel, and Israel has a covenant with God. This is a long-standing. It's basically the plot summary of the Hebrew Bible, right? God has a covenant with these people, and it's God is going to be faithful to that covenant because that's what God does. The problem is for Paul that here he thinks he's living near the end of the world, or at least near the end of the age in which he's living. He thinks as the world is about to turn, as the world is coming to some crisis, Gentiles don't have this kind of relationship, and they need to get on board. They need to answer this call that the God of Israel is making to them. They don't need to do that, though. This is crucial for Paul. They don't need to do that by becoming Jews. That's not their lane. They're not Israel. They're not supposed to go become Jews because Israel is Israel. For Gentiles, I think Paul is suggesting you've got this event that has happened. God has done this for you through Jesus and through the faithfulness of Jesus to the mission that God gave him. And because of that, a door has been opened, a call has been made, and you Gentiles now can be saved from the wrath that is to come, from this big calamity that he thinks is just over the horizon. So it's really all these things where Paul looks like he's criticizing the Jewish law. He is for Gentiles. His audience is Gentiles. He's speaking to Gentiles, and those people shouldn't try to keep the law. They shouldn't try to go get circumcised. They shouldn't try to keep kosher. It's not for them. It's not yours. It's something like cultural appropriation, to use
Mm,
our 21st century language. And instead, they should pay attention to the thing Paul's proclaiming, which is Christ in him crucified.
beautiful. Emily gets to the point and says, "Come as you are." That's it. Yeah. Good
Yeah.
stuff. Well, let's get to some more specific accusations that are often leveled against Paul. We
Mhm.
talked about anti-Semitism, but before we move on, you had mentioned that Paul thought that Jesus was the Messiah of the Jews and the Son of God. One of the big questions in that belief is, what do you think it means for Paul to use those titles for Jesus? What does it mean for Paul to call Jesus the Son of God?
Complicated.
Yeah.
It's complicated. Yeah, and sometimes counterintuitive. So I think there's a bunch of ways to think about that. My favorite way to think about it actually is in sort of a political valence, right? That there are there's so many words in the early Christian lexicon that have all these sort of double meanings or double edges to them, and I think both Son of God and Messiah are in that category where we think of them as theological terms, and not much to do with anything else. But I think in the first century in the Roman Empire, you would have had to think about those terms as pretty explicitly imperial, and or at least connected to the exercise of power. So a Messiah is, or Christ is the Greek version of that, Christos, a Mashiach in Hebrew. This is a person who is anointed as a king of Israel, and that's a very political kind of thing. It's an act that makes you a king, and they're calling Jesus that thing. And if you are the king of Israel, as Pilate put his finger on in the Passion narratives, if you're the king of Israel, we have a problem, right? Because we already have a king, and you're not him. The same is true for Son of God. That might seem like a more straightforwardly theological phrase. It's really not. This is a title that was adopted for himself by Augustus Caesar, because he was the adopted son of Julius Caesar, who upon his death was deified by the Senate, so the Roman Senate. So he calls himself the son of a god. He puts that on his coins, and it becomes a thing that emperors say about themselves off and on for a long time. So to claim that Jesus is the son of God is in some ways to claim that Caesar is not really the son of a god. To claim that Jesus is a Messiah is in some ways to claim that Caesar is not Caesar, is not the emperor. And it's all kind of tied up in, it's both theological and political. It's entangled together in a way that it's hard for us to separate, because we think of religion and politics as two separate realms. So when I think when Paul uses those terms, he's just participating in the language that early Christianity used, but he's also being kind of sneaky
Mm-hmm.
and sort of provocative in that he's saying things, that it's sort of in the category of let the reader understand, right? He's making claims about not only Jesus and Jesus's status with regard to the divinity, but also about the legitimacy of the political systems in which he was living.
This is another struggle that people have is the book of Revelation. But I see Revelation doing very similar things to how you're talking about Paul right now.
Precisely, yeah. And
Yeah.
there's been some great books on that too, that sort of read it that way,
Yeah.
which are really valuable.
Little political subversion, some good trouble. It's when the early Christians go around saying Jesus is Lord. People would go around saying Caesar is Lord. So the early Christians were like, nope, nope, Jesus is Lord. There's that political subversion underneath that. If we have the eyes to see, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So let's go to misogyny, and this is one of the biggest issues that progressives have against Paul. And your book does a great job with this. I first learned about this misreading of Paul in my New Testament class in seminary, where our professor had us read the passage from First Corinthians. I think it's 12, is it? And 11, and was like, okay, read this, and then take out the part about women being silent in church. Take that out and see if it makes sense. It almost makes better sense without the women in there. Can you talk a little bit about that, like the history of that, and what we've discovered about women being silent in church from First Corinthians chapter 11?
So there's actually two places in First Corinthians where women are at the forefront, and you're thinking, I think, of the one in chapter 14, actually, which is
Okay, yeah.
where Paul says, "Be silent in church." And you'll notice in most modern translations in First Corinthians 14, there's a set of parentheses where that part in there. Maybe I'll just read it real quick because it's short. He's talking about spiritual gifts. He's talking about the gift of prophecy. This is in 14 up to 1433. And then there's parentheses, and it says, "As in all the churches of the saints, women should be silent in the churches, for they're not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. If they want to know something, let them ask their husbands." It goes on a couple more verses, and then end of parentheses. And if you look at the notes, I'm reading the NRSV here.
Mm-hmm.
The note at the bottom says, "Other ancient authorities put verses 34 through 35 after verse 40. This is kind of a dead giveaway that something is up. When ancient manuscripts put a chunk of verses in a different place, that means there's been some sort of confusion in the manuscript tradition. So remember, manuscripts were copied by hand, and it was sort of an imprecise process compared to the printing press, which is how we get our materials mostly today, or the pixels on our screens. So likely what has happened here is someone had been reading 1 Corinthians 14, and they had made a marginal note to themselves. Maybe you've done this in your Bible before. You write a little note in the margin, and they wrote this thing that's in parentheses, "Hey, women should be silent." And the next person to come along and copy it then has a decision to make. They have to decide, is this someone correcting something that got left out of the biblical text, or is this someone's marginal note? And whoever copied it thought it was a correction to the text, and they added it in. Some manuscripts handle it differently, which is a signal that it had been probably a marginal thing in the beginning. And you're right. If you read, if you leave out those verses and just read through, Paul is, as soon as he finishes the parentheses, he's going back to like spiritual gifts and prophecy. It's also in conflict with what is in 1 Corinthians 11. which is an argument basically about how you should dress at church. Um, so in 1 Corinthians 11, there's this section. It's a very strange passage, in my opinion, where Paul goes really into like hair. He's really he's really worried about your hair,
Mhm.
and not only women's hair but men's hair, and who should be having what kind of hair, and whether their head should be covered in the assembly when people get together to do what we would call church. And so there's this really strange passage in there where it says, "For this is 11:10. For this reason, a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels."
Ah,
What does that mean? I don't really know.
mhm.
So, you know, what's interesting to note here is Paul is arguing over how women should dress while they are leading worship. He's not saying women should be out of worship or out of worship leadership. He's saying they should have their head covered while they do it. He's presuming women are praying and prophesying in the assembly. And that passage in chapter 14 is in conflict with this. So why would Paul say in chapter 11 women should put a hat on while they are praying and prophesying, and then in chapter 14 say that they aren't allowed to speak at all? So that kind of underscores that second passage is probably a later addition that slipped in.
And you think that maybe that later addition came from other later New Testament writings, like in is it one of the Timothy letters, or a letter that is often attributed to Paul, but not written by Paul, as most scholars think, that have more anti-women talking in the church letters. So very early on in Christian history, right after Paul, there is this anti-women talking in the church business happening.
That's right. So Margaret Mitchell has this great phrase that I use in the book, where she talks about the pseudo-Pauline material, the stuff that was written in Paul's name after his death. And she says it was written in some ways to fix Paul's legacy
Mm.
in both senses of the word fix, to keep it in place, to solidify it, fix it in place, but also to correct it. And so I think as Christianity, persists, and Paul was wrong, as it turns out, the world didn't end right away, and it becomes it moves into the second century and needs to institutionalize, needs to kind of accommodate itself to life in the empire. It really becomes more conservative over time, and I just mean conservative in the sense of like adapting itself to the customs of the world it was in, and that meant, I think, marginalizing women. If you're in this apocalyptic cult, which is essentially what Christianity was, and you think the world's coming to a conclusion soon, a lot of the rules maybe don't matter so much. These customs of gender roles or whatever, they're not as important. And I think that's what we see reflected in Pauline communities, is this sense that the playing field had been leveled. There's neither slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, male nor female, Jew nor Gentile. It's all good. As time goes on, these writers come along behind Paul and say, wait a minute, we're still here. We've got to like look respectable to our neighbors. And that's when you start to see these traditions come into early Christianity that really put box in women and their roles. So that passage in 1 Corinthians 14, I think, is it may even be later than that. I'm not really sure, but it's of the same mindset. I think you're right to point to some of the pseudo-Pauline material, Colossians, Ephesians, First and Second Timothy, and Titus, as places where this mindset of marginalizing women starts to become more pronounced. And by the way, not only women, but by telling enslaved people not to try to seek freedom, telling children to just obey their parents, it starts to really enforce social structures that didn't seem to matter as much to Paul and the people he was talking to.
Kind of the most important thing for me as I was reading your book that I experienced was when you kept saying, in order to know the difference between Paul and the pseudo Paul stuff that becomes misogynistic later and that gets inserted into First Corinthians, is to see how Paul actually treats women that are in the ministry. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. My favorite chapter, I think, in all of Paul's writings is Romans 16, for this reason, because it's fascinating, and it's a strange chapter anyway. People debate about whether it originally belonged to Romans or not. And some people think this is a general letter and we just have the Roman copy that has, the copy that went somewhere else might have had a different chapter 16. But this chapter is fascinating because it's essentially a list of shout outs. It's a list of, things that Paul wants to say to people he thinks are in the Roman community, who knows them from somewhere or something. And a lot of commenters have noticed a bunch of things about this chapter, which include that he mentions a lot of women, and he uses these verbs to talk about these women that are verbs of labor and daring or risk. And so, for example, he starts by talking about Phoebe, who seems to be a letter carrier. She's probably the one who's carrying the letter on his behalf, and he gives her kind of a recommendation. Hey, do whatever she needs. She's great, and she's been my benefactor, and of other people as well. Then he talks about Prisca and Aquila, a couple that we also meet in Acts. Prisca is mentioned first, somewhat at odds with convention, so she might have been really important. And he says about them, they risked their necks for my life. So sort of daring and labor. Greet Mary in verse 6, who has worked very hard among you, labor. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my relatives, who are in prison with me. They are prominent among the apostles. That's a really fascinating case because scribes for centuries have added an S to the name Junia to make it Junias, to make it a man's name, because they thought if she's an apostle, there's no way, it must be a typo. We must need to make her a man. But it's Junia, according to the oldest and best manuscripts. And so it goes on, there's workers in the Lord, Tryphena and Tryphosa, greet the mother of Rufus. There's all these women, and they're almost all described as like working really hard and being really daring. And so I think here you get kind of a window into the social world of really early Christianity, not only in Paul's churches, but in the Roman church, which was not one of Paul's churches. Or there's actually 5 churches, I think, in view in the letter. So you get this window into how they did their thing, and it turns out women were super critical to that effort, and Paul seems to take that for granted. He's not arguing against it anyway. In fact, he's kind of hyping these women up and saying, say hello to this person who's worked so hard and done so much for us. And to me, that's a valuable kind of counterbalance to things like those passages from 1 Corinthians we were talking about, where it can look like, if you're just reading on a surface level, Paul's being misogynistic. I don't think he's doing that at all for his time and place. Now, he's a person of his time and place. He probably would not stand out among us today as being especially, affirming of women. He had traditional ideas, as everyone in that time did. But for his time and place, I think he's doing a really good job of being an egalitarian thinker, which is praiseworthy, I think.
Yeah. Jessica says, shout out to all the disciples who are women working really hard and being really daring. That's good. I love that.
This is every church I've ever been in, this has been the case, right? Like the world goes around in a church because of the women. And so it's not surprising to me that it would have been the case there too.
Yeah, I've read books. I think it's called Junia is Not Alone by Scott McKnight. Some other books on women in the early church. They make the argument that Phoebe is the letter carrier, as you say, and the letter carrier would more than likely have been the one who went to the churches and read the letter out loud and explained it, answered any questions that somebody might have. Does that ring true? Do you think that that's probably the case with Phoebe, or?
I think it's probably the case. You never know. And it's not necessarily the case that the person carrying the letter would have been literate enough to pull that off. Literacy was a sort of rare skill in those days. So, but maybe somebody who was accompanying her could have read it. We don't really know, right? It's possible she did. It's possible someone else did. But I always like to think about that moment, right, where, we have a letter from Paul. Let's sit down and hear it, and everyone just hears it together. And sometimes there's some awkward stuff in these letters that I'm not sure I would want to hear in front of all my closest friends and family. I'm thinking of 1 Corinthians, for example.
That's good.
Yeah.
What is okay? Everybody's going to be like, what is he talking about in 1 Corinthians?
Well, there's this. So imagine, you're at church, Oh, we have a letter from Paul, 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Someone
Hmm.
starts reading. It's actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of kind that is not even found among pagans, for a man is living with his father's wife. And I just imagine this guy just like looking at his shoes, like, I'm not gonna, they're talking about me. They're not using my name, but that's what we're talking about.
That's
So,
often well. Let's
um,
let's go to Paul and sex. Paul
yeah,
is seen as anti-sex, as being someone. I mean, this goes on together with the misogyny. But what do you make of Paul and any kind of sexual ethic that he might have?
I think most of the time, Paul, when he's talking about sexuality, and this goes for like, sort of garden variety comments about sexual immorality, all the way over to like questions about what we would call homosexuality. I think anytime he's doing that, he's largely thinking about idolatry, and he's thinking about the ways Gentiles, from a Jewish perspective, are stereotypically idolatrous, like lawless, morality-less people, that they just have a hard time controlling themselves. So he includes sexuality of various ways of referring to it in long lists that are called vice lists of things that he thinks are sort of, you know, um, characteristically Gentile ways of behaving. Things like getting drunk, being quarrelsome, getting being a thief, and it also includes things like sexual immorality. Um, that he thinks are just things you ought to not do. I don't think he thinks your salvation depends on not doing those things,
Mm.
but he thinks you just ought not do them because we Jewish people have the law and it tells us not to do these things. So you could maybe not do them as much either.
Mm.
What the problem with that is it's been really weaponized. I grew up in the South, in a somewhat traditional conservative Christian setting, and then as a teenager became an evangelical. And in many ways, the evangelical message to teenagers is centered on this question of like sexuality, and that seems to be the whole point of your religious life, is to avoid uh, realizing that you have a body. And to me, that was a really difficult part of my upbringing. Not that I mean, I say in the book, I didn't really have a lot of offers, but it was a thing that was always on your mind. Like, oh my goodness, if I look the wrong way at somebody, I'm being lustful and I'm gonna go to hell. And I think it was worse even for other people. I think it was gendered in a way that women probably got that a lot worse than men did. So I think we've really weaponized Paul's comments and taken them out of context and out of proportion, and made Paul into this prudish kind of figure that he's really not. What he's asking is for his Gentile Jesus followers to just cool it a little bit, especially because he sees those things as sort of pathways on the way to idolatry. And he's doing that not because he thinks it's a part of their salvation, but because he thinks it has something to do with communal life. It has something to do with um, the ways the world can get to you. It has something to do with idolatry, and he just wishes they would cut it out.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it's in First Corinthians 7 where Paul talks about some sexual ethics,
Mm-hmm.
and actually says that it's better for people not to get married. And as you say, this is probably because he thinks the end of the world is about to come. But
Yep.
he says it's better for you not to get married. But if you can't control your urges, then you can get married. And uh, men, this is where I think he says something like, men, give yourselves to your wives, husband, give yourself to your wives, wives, give yourselves to your husbands in this sexual way. And it's interesting because he does not emphasize what Christian history so often does, is that sex is for procreation. It seems like he's saying that sex is for uh, fulfilling your pleasure. It's for pleasure. It seems that he's saying there, which
Yeah,
is
and
so
he
counterintuitive to what we're so often taught about with Paul. Does that make sense, or am I reading it wrong? Do you think?
no, I think that's right, and it's striking too that he just has this very realistic sense of how human beings work. That sometimes you're just not going to be able to control it,
Uh-huh.
and he uses this word pathos, right, which means like you're just overcome by it. You have to give into it, and so I think for a person who claims to have been celibate, he kind of gets it, that
Yeah.
that it's not always about what you want, um, how you want to act, but sometimes your body wants things. And so what strikes me about First Corinthians chapter 7 is he's really kind of saying, I think here's a rule of thumb, but like it's going to be different for everyone. And he's really being quite flexible in that chapter in a way that I'm not sure the Christian tradition, as I know it in the 20th and 21st centuries, is really recognized.
Yeah, Shahara says, so Paul is sex positive? Yay.
I mean, not really. He's not sex positive, I don't think, but he's realistic.
Mm,
And he also, just as you said a minute ago, he thinks, it doesn't matter that much because he thinks the world is coming to a conclusion, that the time is short, and spending your time on such trivial things might not be that important.
yeah, yeah. He's certainly not nearly as sex negative as the church
Right.
has
That's right.
told us he is. So we're kind of getting around the issue. As you see, I've got the rainbow flag in the background. And what do we do with Romans 1? What do we do with First Corinthians, wherever it is, where Paul talks about same-sex acts? Where Paul uses the term arsenokoitai and malakoi, and the debates that have brought on with so many. What do we do with those?
Yeah. Um, this is ground I think that has been really well covered by a lot of folks, and it's interesting now. Like when I'm scrolling TikTok has figured out that like who I am, and
Uh-huh.
it gives me TikToks on this topic, and I'm like, oh, scroll on because I don't want to. I've heard all these arguments, but this is really, I think, the biggest tempest in a teapot of the study of the New Testament. If you think about like the amount of angst and pain that a set of passages has caused versus the amount of stuff that's actually in the text, there's just not a lot there.
Mm,
Um, a lot of people have pointed out, homosexuality as a translation is a terrible translation because no such thing really existed in the ancient world in the way that we know of it in our world. Um, Even worse, in my opinion, is the word sodomite, which is what several translations use, um, because there are these murky words that arsenokoites and malakoi, um, that are ambiguous. They're not really um, totally clear on what Paul means by them. It seems to have something to do with what we would call same-sex um, sex, but it's not clear. And I think what's happening here is an extension of what I was saying a moment ago, where Paul thinks that Gentiles do a lot of things that they probably ought not do, and he puts these terms in a longer list of things that he thinks people ought not do, like get drunk or steal things. And so I think he's probably, like, if we were to pin Paul down and ask him,
mm,
hey, do you think it's okay for men to marry men and have sex with each other? He would say no, right?
mm,
But that's not what he wrote. He wrote these really kind of vague things that are that have been treated as if they're far more decisive than they really are. And I think you have to read the New Testament, including Paul's writings, within sort of the context in which they're found. He's writing, he's not trying to write sexual ethics for all times and all places. He's writing a letter to the Romans. He's writing a letter to the Corinthians in the first century. He doesn't know about us. So I think we just have to be really maybe epistemologically humble about what we can take away from those, and just recognize that some of our modern translations, and certainly our modern theological traditions, are way more confident in the wrong direction, in my
mm,
opinion, about what these texts say.
mm, mm. What? So I think I'm hearing you say that there's a lot when it comes to sex, including same-sex activity during this time. That there's a lot of is Paul primarily talking about idolatry? Is he saying that this is how they worship God at the temples, and don't go off and do that because you should be worshiping God here? Is that primarily what he's getting at, or is there more to it, do you think?
I mean, it's super hard to know what he's getting at, I think, for
Yeah.
starters. I think that's a strong possibility that he sees, because they use there's one pairing of like male prostitutes and sodomites or something like that. So that might be a reference to temple prostitution. Others read it as unequal or sort of unjust sexual relationships where it's exploitative.
Mhm.
because sex was sometimes indexed to like power relations. And if you were, for example, enslaved, you were at the mercy of your
Mm,
master and what that person wanted to do to you. So those are possibilities. It's also possible he is thinking about, say, men who just like to have sex with men.
mm,
It's just really hard to know, and I think we have to be humble about it.
gotcha.
With in keeping in mind, right, that he lived in the first century. And I think one question for those of us who read the New Testament and take it seriously is, do we feel bound by every cultural norm um, of the first century, right? Because the Bible presumes the existence of slavery in the same way it presumes the supremacy of heterosexuality. That doesn't mean we have to accept that and that we have to like proceed on that basis. It presumes the Roman Empire. That doesn't mean we have to like restore the Roman
Mm,
Empire. So
right.
we have to be able to sort through, you know, what the Bible is saying about its own time and place, and pull out of that, if we want to, we might not want to, ethical kind of guidelines. Keeping in mind, Paul didn't mean to write ethical guidelines. He's just writing a letter, and we're reading his mail 2,000 years later.
Mhm, mhm. That's good. Jeff has a question. Do you know the book Paul and Jesus by James Tabor? If so, can you comment on it?
I don't. I have never read that book actually. I do know who James Tabor is, and he does really interesting work. I like his work, especially because he does a lot of material culture, which I'm really interested in. But I have not read that one. I'll have to check it out.
Okay, awesome. Jeff, if you would like to comment on it, I'd like to know what you have to say about it. Let's talk a little bit about Romans 13, because this is a
Uh,
passage that is often used for political quietism. It seems as though whenever like a certain party is not is in power, that it will use this passage to say we can do whatever we want because God has ordained the powers that be to be there, and you shouldn't criticize us for the decisions that we make. And then when they're out of power, they tend to forget about all of Romans 13. So what do we do with Romans 13? It's tends to be translated in ways where Paul is saying that God has ordained the rulers, and you should obey the rulers and not question them, things like that. What do we make? So what do we do with Romans 13?
yeah, and it's not, it's not just American politics where this happens. There's
Mm.
examples from colonial governments that say this to the people they've colonized. Like, look, it says right here in Romans, you've got to listen and do whatever we say.
Well, and
Slaveholders use this in. Sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
no, I was going to say, and this is one of the passages that is used in Nazi Germany, for example, to encourage Christians to some kind of political quietism and not go up against Hitler. So
Yeah.
it's they're very very dangerous ways of using Romans 13 in this
Yeah.
way. So
Yeah, and it is an interesting chapter. There are some people who read it as saying that on the surface, and then kind of a wink and a nod under the surface. There's a
mm,
great book a few like 15 years ago by Neil Elliott called The Arrogance of Nations, that thinks that the whole letter to the Romans is sort of a subtle, under the surface critique of empire in a really interesting kind of way. Um, my favorite interpretation of this section here is to read it in light of what the rest of the letter seems to be worried about, which is relationships between Jewish and Gentile Jesus followers in the city of Rome. This is what Paul is spending most of the first,
yeah.
12 chapters talking about. So why would he change gears suddenly here? And so the word here that is translated like ruling authorities or rulers. We were talking about this before we went live. Is the word archontes, which can mean those things, but there actually were better words Paul could have used if he meant like the emperor or your governor or something like that. I think it's equally likely that what he's talking about here is synagogue authorities, and that he's writing to his Gentile Jesus follower friends in the city of Rome and saying, look, those of you who are Gentile followers of Jesus, I've heard that you're not recognizing the authority of synagogue leaders, but they are put there by God. They
Mm,
are ordained to lead, and the taxes, the sort of contributions they ask for you are legitimate, and you should you should respect their authority. You should respect that God has put them in the positions they are. I think that makes more sense of this passage than reading it as a defense of governmental power. Um, I didn't plan to include this chapter in the book. Actually, I had not thought about including this section, and then I was writing this book in like 2018, and Jeff Sessions, who was the Attorney General of the United States, quoted Romans 13 in defense of the child separation at the border policy. And he, in like an interview, he said, as Romans 13 says, we should respect government authority. These people are not doing that, so it's cool that we're, separating them from their children and locking their children up. And I thought, well, there's a new chapter to this book. So I had to email the publisher and say, hey, could I tack on a chapter? Because it was just egregious. But this is the kind of argument that people in power tend to make, which is, there's nothing you can do nothing you could say about my exercise of power because Paul says it's all legitimate. And that does not strike me as a plausible reading of this chapter.
Well, and the same people who used that argument at that time, Jeff Sessions, would celebrate the American Revolution, which is all about resisting governmental authority at the time. America is based on not following his interpretation on Romans 13, and then he just uses it.
Mm-hmm.
We can talk about Christian hypocrisy on all kinds of sides all the time, but
sure.
But that's always fun. But we'll move on. So, kind of the last one that I wanted to talk about before we get to that. Let's see, Raylene. Let me try to word this in a little bit. She says a little off topic, but Raylene, like many Christians, and this is something that I think that is good to work through, is struggling with the notion of being a chosen people, or because aren't we all children of God? Being a chosen people or a special people. What do we do with that? And it's always important when we're talking about this. We began by talking about anti-Semitism, and so it's always important to struggle with these issues as Christians, knowing that can be in the background of this when we talk about the chosen people of God and what that means for Israel, what that means for our Jewish siblings as well. So any thoughts on that, especially when it comes to Paul and how he's kind of universalizing Judaism in this text?
Sure. So I think, first of all, there's a difference between ancient religion and what we think of as religion in the modern world, where we do tend to have universalizing understandings of, we're all God's children, that kind of thing. In the ancient world, deities sort of belonged to people, to nationalities, to what we call ethnic groups. And it was very common for, a god to be a god of a place and a people rather than a god of the world. That was not really a very common way to think about the divine. So when Israel talks about itself as God's people, God's chosen people, that's very kind of normal, not remarkable in any way, except that we still have a lot of books that they wrote about it. That's what's really distinct. And you see, over time, the development of sort of a broader consciousness. So Second Temple Judaism had already begun to kind of work this out. Even the prophetic tradition, as we said earlier, had begun to work this out over time, that, hey, maybe our God is not only the God of us, but maybe our God was the creator of the world. Maybe our God is also known other places. Maybe we could share this God other places. And so when you get to someone like Paul, and Jesus, you can see this in the Gospels too, right? There's several narratives where Jesus is sort of bumping up against the edges of his own identity, like with the Syrophoenician woman or the Samaritan woman at the well. The New Testament tells these stories of Jesus almost kind of working it out in real time, like, okay, maybe it's okay for me to interact with these folks, and maybe the reach of this way of thinking about the world reaches beyond my own people. So I think by the time you get to Jesus and Paul, we turned a corner toward thinking about it a little bit more broadly, but this our modern sense of it is really dramatically different, where we think of religions as sort of big organizing systems that can be universal, and especially Christianity thinks that way, and Islam and some of the major world religions.
Yeah, I've heard some folks say that the call of Abraham, when God chooses this family in Genesis 12, is not. We think of it as like being selfish and yay, it's all about us and doesn't God love us and stuff, right? We're the chosen ones. But the whole call story is not that you are so blessed and chosen to keep that for yourself, but that you are to share it with all the families of the earth. I think is what it says. It's like this not, this isn't for you, but God is blessing you so that all the families of the world will be blessed as well through you.
Yeah, that's in there from the beginning, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, that there's, yes, it is actually for you, but it's also for the world.
Yes.
It's a blessed to be a blessing kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think kind of my final question is something that I've been kind of struggling with lately. Is you've talked about how Paul thought, and Jesus may have thought this too, that the end of the world was coming. Jesus says, some of you of this generation won't die because the end is imminent, right? What do we do with that? That they got that wrong, or that we're misinterpreting what they're saying, or does the early church begin to interpret it in different ways, metaphorically, or what do we do with that?
Yeah, you can actually see Paul wrestling with this in real time in First Thessalonians 4, where he seems to have had a really dear relationship with the church in Thessaloniki, and he apparently had gotten some sort of letter from them where they were like, "Hey, Paul, people are starting to die. Has the promise failed?
Mm.
Were you wrong?" And so in First Thessalonians 4, Paul sort of says, "No, the promise hasn't failed. In fact, they're going to be the first ones." Um, and he's got this dramatic uh, section where he says in 4:17, "We who are alive, who are left, will be caught up in the clouds together with them to meet the Lord in the air." This is, by the way, the only scriptural warrant for the rapture. The word rapture doesn't appear in the Bible, but that's where the idea comes from. It's not in Revelation at all. So you can kind of see Paul thinking through this in real time. And by the time you get, I think Paul probably died in the early 60s, still expecting um, the eschaton, or the parousia, the return of Jesus. I think he probably always held on to that, but he moderated it over time to say, maybe it's not going to be next Tuesday, maybe it's going to be a year or two from now. Maybe we're going to have to wait a little while longer. And the tradition then comes to terms with that over time. So you can see that in the pastoral epistles we mentioned earlier, where they're kind of setting up what are sometimes called household codes. Like here's the way slaves and masters, husbands and wives, parents and children should relate to each other, because we need some structure because we're going to be here a while. And then over time, Christianity has sort of settled into this status quo, but every so often kind of spins out an apocalyptic fervor. And this happens, with some regularity, where someone decides, oh, it's going to be whenever, and we all wait for it and are disappointed. Um, so, it's something Christians do repeatedly, and it's something I think there's been that sense of disappointment really from the beginning. There's this great line in Acts chapter 1, like it's either verse 6 or 8, I can't recall, where Jesus has just been resurrected and all the apostles are there with him, and they're in Jerusalem, and they're like, great, now's the time, right? Like, this is the moment when you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel. And Jesus is like, well, no, I'm going to send you the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit's going to help you become witnesses to the end of the earth. And that's not quite the same thing. I think there was probably a sense of disappointment even in that moment. But that I think Paul probably lived his life still thinking it was going to happen, and probably was disappointed that he missed it.
Mm-hmm. What do we do? You mentioned the rapture, and that has been used in very, I don't know, dangerous ways that are that go against caring for the earth, that go against, believing in climate change, or maybe we believe in climate change, but who cares, because Jesus is going to come and rapture everybody up anyway. So just destroy the earth. And the faster that we destroy the earth, the faster Jesus is going to come and save the elect. Very harmful, horrible theological perspective. But what do we do with the rapture, with First Thessalonians that you mentioned there? How do we combat that? How do we deal with it?
Yeah, it's as I said, I grew up sort of in that subculture in the 80s and 90s. I can remember going to a Christian bookstore, and they would have a sale table out front, and on that sale table were like Hal Lindsey books, like Why the World's Going to End in 1983, Why the World's Going to End in 1984, why inside you could buy 1991.
Whoops.
Right. And I remember thinking, oh, something's weird about this. Maybe he just was wrong, got his math wrong or whatever. I think the first thing and the main thing for me is just to recognize that whole structure of thinking about time is profoundly unbiblical. You can only arrive at it by taking pieces from a bunch of different places, rearranging them out of order, completely out of context, and writing a little narrative around it, which is what the Left Behind books did so well. Is to just encase it in another narrative. So it's fictional, really. I mean, there's pieces in there that come from books like First Thessalonians and Revelation, Daniel, a bunch of places like that. But it's fictional. It's a rearranging that takes it and makes it into something that it was never meant to be if you just look at the plain reading of the New Testament. So most of the people that I've talked to who grew up with a lot of anxiety about, if the rapture comes, is my best friend going to be saved, whatever. Most of the people I've talked to about that feel a sense of relief once they just realize that it's really more about what the Left Behind book said than anything the New Testament says, and anything Paul says or Revelation or anything. It's fictional in a way that I'm not sure we fully reckoned with yet.
What do you think Paul is actually saying in those passages, if it's not kind of a rapture thing? What do you think he's saying?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think Paul did expect some sort of radical intervention into the world. But already at that point, the modern 21st century proponents of that are at odds with Paul, because they have to say Paul was wrong about it. If they're right about it, Paul's wrong. And if Paul's right, they're wrong. But I think Paul did expect, something. He doesn't really talk about the kingdom of God in the way that Jesus does. Paul doesn't really talk about much that Jesus talks about. But I think he expected something like that, like an intervention, like a reassertion of God's power in the world. And maybe that was the end of the world. Maybe that was a reconfiguring of it in the way that we see, like in Revelation 21. I'm not sure. He never really spells it out for us, but I think he did expect something radical. But not, I don't think scary if you were Israel, and not even if you were part of the Gentiles by the time he was done with his work. He calls it the wrath of God, that, God's coming to like intervene against all of the sinful ways. But Jesus had made it acceptable to God. Jesus had been the way that God had made this okay, and sort of averted the wrath. So I think if Paul thought he'd done his work well, then that was all off the table anyway.
Okay, good.
He's not really clear about it. It's murky. Yeah.
Like much of the Bible, a little murky, murky here and there. So,
which is what it makes it fun, I think.
It does make it fun, and thank you for wading through the murkiness of it all with us today, Eric. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. If people want to keep up with you and your work, is there a way they can do that?
Yeah, I've got a Substack that I started. Maybe they could follow me there. I post a couple times a week there, ericcsmith.substack.com. And you can always keep up with me, by emailing me at my institutional address, which you can find on the ilf.edu website.
Awesome. Thank you, Eric. The book, again, is called Paul the Progressive, and I encourage you to check it out. And thank you, everybody, for being here. You can keep up with One Question with Pastor Adam every Thursday live on Facebook, and also I post it later to YouTube. And you can also listen to it wherever you listen to podcasts. It's been a joy, Eric. Thank you for being here. And friends, hope you have a great week, and we will do it all again soon. So take care, everybody.
Thanks.